Hey guys, welcome back to Alienation, or if you're new here, hi, hello, my name's Megan, and every single Sunday I sit down and talk about some form of weird and not so wonderful topic that really interests me. And today we do have another true crime case. However, I'm going to have a very quick rant. This case has been the bane of my life for the last few days. Not necessarily because of the case itself, but because getting all the information for this case down to sitting down and actually recording this, it's caused me nothing but stress. It was a tough one. It was so difficult to put together. So it was actually a requested topic and a requested case from my friend Alicia. So thank you so much, but also thank you for making this such a big challenge. So today, if you've not guessed by the title, we are going to be talking about Nottingham's first and hopefully last serial killer, Mark Martin. So basically, one of the reasons why this was so difficult to put together is I could find barely any information on this case. It was a very tough one to research. It took me the longest time to research and pull together a decent sort of file case, I guess. And then my ass went and deleted it all, didn't I? And then I couldn't restore any of my research. So I've had the biggest nightmare researching this case. But either way, I'm finally here, finally going to talk about it. But like I said, there isn't much to go off. So if I get some of this information wrong, I am so sorry. There are going to be some intense topics going on in this episode. So here's my little disclaimer as usual. Warning, today's episode contains contents and descriptions that some audience members may find disturbing. So viewer and listener discretion is advised. So let's just get into it. So if you didn't know, Nottingham is in the UK and we're going to briefly talk about our serial killer. So it's a little bit obvious that he is our serial killer. There's kind of no way to tell this story, I say in air quotations, without just stating who the serial killer was. So I'm going to do a little bit of background about Mark Martin himself. But Mark was born in 1981. Mark was born and raised in Ilkeston in UK, and this is in Derbyshire. So he lived at home with his mum. His mum was a Filipino woman, and I'm not sure about his father, in all honesty. I couldn't really find much information about his dad. I don't know if his dad was in his life, but regardless, he had a dad, obviously. We just don't know where he is in this case. Mark, unfortunately, was bullied all throughout school. He didn't have the best time while he was at school, both primary and secondary school. And he was mostly bullied because he had a birthmark under his eye. If you are watching, you will see the photos. If not, give him a quick Google. But he had this birthmark under his right eye, and it did actually look like a teardrop, you know, like the cliche tattoo that they get in prison. It kind of looks like that. And he was given the nickname Reds by his fellow classmates. So he was bullied, he was called Reds, and he was also picked on as well because his mum wasn't English. Kids can be so mean. Like, kids are dickheads, aren't they? And as Mark grew up, he became exceptionally violent. He was very aggressive, specifically around his teenage years. And something that is a major red flag, Mark's childhood heroes weren't your normal celebrities or footballers or, I don't know, any sort of normal role model that kids have. Mark didn't have those. Mark's role models were a little bit different. He admired, he idolised and looked up to gangsters and serial killers. A bit foreshadowing that, isn't it? He absolutely idolised the Moors murderer, so Ian Brady, as well as the Black Panther. All of the well-known serial killers that you probably shouldn't be idolising. We can be interested in these things, hence why I create this content, but to idolise them, this is a little bit worrying, especially as a child, like as a teenager. That's the major red flag right there, isn't it? So Mark had a friend called Gareth Moyes while he was at school, and he used to brag to him all the time about how the two of them were going to become the next Cray twins, or the Cray brothers. You'd run a mile, wouldn't you? But I don't want to hang around with this person anymore. If you don't know, you can research it if you want, but the Cray twins were not very good people. They were murderers, they were sort of gangsters, thieves, just overall not very good people. And he wanted him and Gareth to become the next Cray brothers. So Gareth used to just laugh it off, you know, kind of like you would when your friend says silly things, just to sort of please him and keep him like happy. But deep down, Gareth knew something was just wrong and well off with Mark. Mark's behaviour was very questionable in a lot of aspects of his life, and at one point Mark was actually caught trying to smother a baby to death while he was still a kid. Like early teenagers, he tried smothering a baby to death simply because it was crying. Yeah, intense. I mean, no one likes the sound of a baby crying, but oh my god, that's a lot. So anyway, when Mark was around the age of 15, he did start taking drugs. Started off by smoking weed, doing cannabis, then progressed on to taking speed. Only at 15, that's so young. He did get himself into some dodgy dealings and ended up with a criminal record. I suppose it's what he wanted. He wanted to be a criminal. So he got a record for burglary, common assault, threatening behaviour, possession of offensive weapons, and even attempted robbery. So his list was building up quite quick. quick. And then there seemed to be a turning point in his life where he went from bad to kind of worse, and this was when his father died. So like I said, I know he has a father figure, I just don't know what relationship he had with him, but regardless, his father did pass away, and Mark was aware of this. And when Mark told Gareth about his father passing away, he was just laughing, which is questionable, and Gareth thought this was a little bit questionable too. Jumping ahead to 2002, Mark wrote a letter to his probation officer, and it said questionable things, surprisingly. It said, quote, "I was so sweet and nice until my dad died, and now I'm evil," unquote. So he had both female and male friends growing up, but when he hung around with his female friends, he was very aggressive towards them. He would pretty much be verbally and physically abusive towards them, so he'd yell at them, he'd call them names, he'd even hit them, push them around. So again, more red flags, more very questionable behaviour. And going back to that same letter that he wrote to his probation officer, he also asked, quote, "How long till I kill? It could be a lady, pets, anything," unquote. He's seeming like a really nice person so far, isn't he? It's all going so well for Mark. But again, we're just going to jump ahead a bit because there isn't that much information, I'm afraid. But we're in the 2000s, around 2002, Mark had a wife, so at some point he had got married. But again, we don't know much about her in the slightest, we just know Mark was married. And surprisingly, he was very violent to her as well. He was aggressive, he yelled at her all the time, he'd push her around, pretty much abused her, which is very sad. And he even admitted to a probation officer again that he did love her and he didn't want to lose her. You know, when you're like, well, why are you being a fucking arsehole then? Anyway, in 2002, she was pregnant with their son. And once again, he was violent towards her and he abused her. He took her by the throat in a car park, so they were both in the car. He grabbed her by the throat, hit her repeatedly, and he even threatened her with a Stanley knife. So again, it just sounds like such a pleasant chap. But in October of 2004, he did get arrested for the abuse towards his wife. So her right eye was bruised. Both sides of her nose were red, so clearly she'd been smacked around the face a lot. Her upper lip was cut and she had red marks and bruises around her neck, so he'd clearly choked her, gone for her again, which is so sad. It's just disgusting. So the day after this, Mark actually called 999. He told the person on the other end of the phone, so the police operator, that he'd been locked up the previous night for trying to strangle his wife, and he was now having very bad thoughts, and he believed that he was going to actually kill someone. Brilliant. I'm not sure what came from that call, I have no idea, but basically the wife turned around and said, "Look, I don't trust you to be alone with our son in the slightest. I think we're both out," which good for her. And Mark basically lost his shit, lost his temper, obviously was absolutely furious, so he left. Thank God he left. So he decided to move from Ilkeston, so home with his family, to Nottingham, which was about 8 miles away. However, he didn't leave and get himself a new home. He chose to join the homeless community. He had money, he had a house, like I said. He wasn't the sort of person who had to be homeless, but for some reason he chose to join the homeless community. So he started showing up in all of the homeless community sort of hangout spots, so his soup kitchens, places where they would sleep, their safe spaces, all that jazz, and was kind of trying to weave his way through the community. And he stood out by a mile. A lot of the homeless community unfortunately have drug or alcohol addictions, but Mark was well dressed, he didn't have any issues like that, he was clean, but regardless he chose to hang around the homeless community and he started to sort of befriend a lot of the people who were part of this community. However, he mostly chose to befriend the people who had the more severe alcohol or drug issues, so the ones who would potentially be a little bit weaker or maybe were easier targets. So all the volunteers and the outreach workers were very confused. They were like, who is this guy? Like, why is he here? He didn't belong there. And one of these volunteers did actually say that Mark was a very, very intimidating person and he kind of just did what he wanted. So he stood out for a lot of reasons, like I mentioned, but he stood out physically because, one, he was a very big guy. He was very, very tall and he was very well built as well, mostly due to the fact that he did take steroids, so he sort of filled out a bit. So as time went on, he started to build himself a bit of a rep in this community. And by December of 2004, Mark fully lived within the homeless community. He had a tent and a shelter on a bit of land near the warehouses off Great Northern Close. And this was near London Road in Nottingham. So it's kind of like near the city centre. So these warehouses were built in 1857, but they were like abandoned. I think they got fire damage because there was a fire there in 1998. So no one really went there apart from homeless people. And those guys used it as kind of a safe space. It was sheltered to an extent and they could take drugs sort of peacefully without the police interfering, so it was kind of only the homeless community that hung around there. So he's all set up, he's got himself his nice little tent, And he would go about his day bullying other homeless people. He would intimidate them, he'd take their money, so any money that they could acquire, or if they received benefits and money that way, he would take that from them. So again, prying on all the vulnerable people, those who seem to have drug and alcohol problems, he would sort of go for those guys. But he'd go for anyone really, but those people he'd aim at the most. And if you think back, Mark still has money, he still does have a house, he's not struggling. So he could bribe people really easily with things like cigarettes, alcohol, and intimidate them. Yeah, he just had this overall power over the homeless community. And one homeless person even said, quote, "If you heard Reds was on one side of town, you would go to the other. When he knew you had drugs or money, he would look for you and take it off you." Unquote. And he would also start to boast about how one day he was going to make a name for himself. So word was spreading massively around this community. So not only between the homeless people themselves, but also the volunteers, that he was basically a psychopath, that he was severely dangerous and he was capable of some serious violence. So a lot of people were terrified of him. So we come to January the 25th. There were some sources that did say the 24th, but around the 24th or the 25th of January in 2005, the police and the fire department were called out to a huge fire that had broken out in a block of flats in Marple Square. So this was quite a popular destination for the homeless people in the area because it was abandoned. I think it was due to be demolished, so at the time it was completely abandoned, but it still had gas and electric, so a lot of people did like to go there. And sadly, after putting the fire out and searching the place, they found the burnt remains of Ellen Frith, and she was the first victim that they found in this case. So I'm going to quickly talk about Ellen. I do sometimes like to talk about each of the victims because I think they just deserve so much more. But Helen was born in Chesterfield and she moved to Ripley with her parents in 1992. And while she was there, she attended Mill Hill School. It's a bit of a mouthful. But at 16, she did actually turn to drugs. She started smoking cannabis, but when she was 17, she unfortunately, along with a lot of her young male friends, she did start trying stronger and harder drugs. So eventually she did move to Nottingham and she lived in the YMCA for about a year. Unfortunately, her mental health did deteriorate a little bit. She started hearing voices and she thought her parents were going to kill her, but she was diagnosed with cannabis psychosis. Her dad did say that he basically tried everything that he could to help her, try and get her off the drugs, but unfortunately sometimes there is only so much that you can do, and he last saw her on New Year's Eve in 2004. He did also think that her moving to Nottingham would really help her, but unfortunately it was just the wrong crowd she fell into and bad timing for everything. It's just so sad. But her father did say she was a lovely person and only had really nice things to say about her. But Ellen was actually part of this Nottingham homeless community that I've mentioned. She was well known amongst her peers there and very much so liked. So the police immediately got on with this investigation. Clearly this was not an accident. So they started to question a lot of the people within this community and they wanted to find out who frequented these flats. And funnily enough, 3 names kept coming up. Guess whose name was amongst those 3? You guessed it, good old Mark Martin. So there were 2 other names mentioned. One was 34-year-old John Ashley and the other one was 30-year-old Dean Carr. So one witness actually described how they had seen Mark in an alleyway after the fire. Mark had basically told him how he'd strangled Ellen and killed her after she wouldn't lend him a tenner for drugs. A tenner. Wow. Another witness had also said that they'd overheard Mark having a conversation with another man outside his flat. And he basically said that he'd overheard Mark saying that he'd just killed a girl, strangled her, and had to go back into the flat to set fire to her body. So basically within a few days from all the testimonies from all the witnesses and a lot of the people from the homeless community coming forwards with statements, the police were basically able to go and arrest Mark Martin and John Ashley for the murder of Ellen. So they were taken into custody and they were basically just waiting their charges. So obviously Dean Carr would have been arrested at some point, but I'm not too sure how that all worked out. But regardless, 3 guys ended up in custody. So the other 2 guys started to talk straight away. They had no issues pinning it on each other and chatting away, basically confessing everything. However, Mark refused to talk. He stayed quiet, didn't say a word, which is weird for Mark because he likes to chat pure shit. However, when he was being held, so when he was in his cell and in jail waiting for his trial, he did not stop running his mouth. He was so proud of himself. He was constantly telling everyone what he did and was bragging about what he was capable of, and he was loving how much fear it was causing between the other inmates. Everyone was scared of him. So this was giving him a lot of power in jail and he was thriving. And Mark told fellow inmates, quote, "I'm going to be Nottingham's first serial killer. If you have killed 1, you might as well have killed 21. unquote. Ugh, he's such a prick. So behind the scenes, the police were carrying on with building a case against the two guys, mostly Mark, because they knew he was the main culprit and the main suspect. And they continued questioning people from the homeless community. But rumours started to spread, and obviously with the police being around all the time, they were hearing of these rumours that basically there may be other victims. And sadly enough, around the same time, 2 other women had gone missing from the homeless community. One of those women was named Katie Baxter, and sadly she was only 18 years old around the time she went missing. She'd been last seen at her sister's house in Gamston on December 29th, 2004, and I'm just going to briefly talk about Katie. So Katie spent the first 2.5 years of her life in Cottgrave. But then her family did move to Nigeria, and then I think around 3.5 years later, they decided to move back. Obviously, Katie was a lot younger, so she was a lot more vulnerable, and even though she didn't need to be homeless or need to be sleeping rough, she chose to do it because a lot of her friends were doing it, and she kind of got in with that crowd. She had a home with her parents, she had a home and was always welcome at her sister's too, but it was just a choice that she made. She kind of got involved with the city's homeless people after splitting up with her first serious boyfriend. And it was here that she actually met John Ashley, and I believe they had some form of relationship. I am not too sure, but regardless, Kate is a lot younger. She is an adult, but yeah, she is a lot younger, so a lot more vulnerable. And on the night of December 27th, so a couple of days before she went missing, she ended up in hospital. She was at the Queen's Medical Centre, where she had to have stitches in her nose and her mouth. Her dad picked her up the next morning and found out that John Ashley had actually assaulted her. Lovely. And then a few days later, the parents started to get very worried because Katie's favourite ice hockey team that she supported was the Nottingham Panthers. She started to miss a lot of their home matches, which isn't something that she would normally do. And then basically after hearing that firefighters had found a body of a homeless person, so in the fire that we've mentioned, they panicked and reported her missing to the police. So the police started searching the area. Specifically, they were looking at the old packing houses off Great Northern Close and like those warehouses we mentioned, and a lot of it was kind of wasteland. There was a lot of crap there, so they had to bring in the cadaver and sniffer dogs to sort of scout out the area because there's only so much dirt and crap that you can go through by hand. And sadly, on February 11th 2005, they found the partly buried decomposed remains of Katie. She was found near like an old wall heater. There was debris, soil, bricks, just dirt, random things like placed on top of her, so she wasn't buried properly in the slightest. There was a charred piece of wood nearby, and overall she wasn't hidden very well. So excavating her body started. Forensics got on with what they needed to do, and sadly they were completely unaware at the time that a second body lay very close nearby, less than 2 meters away. So a few days later, on February 16th, the body of the 26-year-old Zoe Pennick was found, and she was our second homeless person to go missing. So similar, they found a burnt piece of wood next to her grave. There was debris piled over, foliage, bricks. She just wasn't buried well enough either. So clearly this was the same murderer using the same dump site for these two bodies. So Zoe was known as a bright, bubbly and generous girl, just like the other two. She loved to sing, she loved to dance, but unfortunately she did end up getting sucked into the whole drug lifestyle, and that completely changed everything about her. She went to West Park Community School in Spondon and went to a secondary school in Derby, and she began skipping lessons and running away from home, running away from school, and she was reported missing by her parents. So when Zoe was just 16, she did move into a hostel in Derby. Just a year later, she actually got arrested for shoplifting. She fell pregnant, and in 1996 she had her first son, and in 2002 she had her second, and having these kids did actually give her a bit of stability, you know, gave her something to hold on to, something to help get her life back together. She did have her own flat in Derby, but she just chose to associate and spend a lot of time with the homeless community. Her father last saw her in December 2004 because she nipped back to the house to collect some of her belongings, but a few weeks later he did report her missing because they hadn't heard from her. So it was very obvious at this point that the person who had committed these crimes committed all three of them, and they had no question at all about who it was and who did it. Luckily, their prime suspect, Mark Martin, was already in custody. He'd already been arrested for Ellen's murder, and because sadly all three of the girls had been strangled and discarded of, they knew it was him. So the police were back to building up the case. There was now even more to look into because there wasn't just one victim, but there was now 3 separate victims. Unfortunately for the police, this investigation was not an easy one in the slightest, so they came across a few problems when trying to pull their case together. together. So the Nottingham Police Department had this entire case that was built up from witness statements, witness testimonies, all of who were from the homeless community. So if it's not obvious already, a lot of the homeless community do not have a permanent fixed address. So trying to locate each of these people, track them down, get their witness statements, and even get them to appear in court, give evidence and all that lot was very, very difficult. One of their main witnesses that they really needed for this case was one of Mark Martin's jailmates. And sadly, this jailmate was so scared to testify because, like I said, Mark was a horrible, intimidating, nasty person that it took the police 2 weeks to convince him to go on the stand and basically give evidence against Mark. So it did come to the trial. So this was in January 16, 2006, and it was held at the Nottingham Crown Court. And there was a huge number of witnesses in this case. I think they said around 30 people actually ended up giving statements. And here is basically what they found. So the first victim was Katie, and Mark picked Katie up and he took her to the warehouse. They went into the tent. I don't really know what went down, but he basically just snapped. That inner rage that he had just came out and he just strangled her. It's pretty much it. No reason. Nothing from what we're aware. It was just a spur of the moment, I'm gonna kill this bitch thing, which is fucking disgusting. Luckily, Katie did manage to scratch Mark. I say this in any case that I can where this is relevant. If you sadly get attacked at any point, scratch your fucking attacker. Get their DNA under your nails, scratch them hard. That is one of the best things that you could do. Sadly, Mark was not an idiot. Well, he is. In my opinion, he is. Because if you have that outlook on life where you're like, I want to be a serial killer, you're an idiot regardless. But he was kind of intelligent and he knew that she would have DNA under his fingernails, so he burnt her fingers, I'm afraid, dragged her outside and buried her. But then just a few days later, Mark persuaded Zoe, our next victim, to go into his tent because he claimed he had 2,000 cigarettes that he wanted her to sell for him. And apparently she left a syringe of blood on his bed, so I don't know if she had it in a pocket or whatever and it fell out, but once again he snapped, completely lost it, grabbed her by the throat and strangled her. So he bragged to all of his inmates that he'd sorted her out, and this is quite a disgusting phrase, but he said he smashed her legs like biscuits and that no one would be seeing her for a while. He also said that it was really hard to sort of kill her because she really didn't want to die and she put up a bit of a fight, and in the end he ended up punching her and kicking her and had to stand on her throat, which is so sad. And if you aren't aware of this, a lot of the time when someone passes away they do end up soiling themselves because everything just sort of goes, it relaxes. So sadly she did end up soiling herself, and this made Mark vomit. He threw up all over. Doesn't have a very good stomach for a serial killer, does he? He had to basically remove her t-shirt because it then had his DNA on it, and then buried her right next to Katie. Obviously, we already know the details of Ellen's murder, but I'll go into a little bit more detail, but this is the order that the murders happened. So Ellen had basically chose to go with the 3 men into the squat to smoke drugs or take drugs. Mark had actually told John his plan. Like, he'd already planned on killing Ellen, so it was premeditated to an extent. Don't think it was planned, but he knew he was going to kill her. So she was in the kitchen having an apple and he basically just grabbed hold of her and he pressed his thumbs into her throat until she passed out. And he basically just turned around to John Ashley and was like, oh, you might as well finish her off. So another witness then basically said that Mark and John had lifted her up, sort of propped her up on the sofa bed, and before he set fire to her body, Mark was playing with the body and making her look like she was talking and stuff, which is disgusting. And then he stabbed her with a needle, so one in her hand and one in her leg, to make it look like she'd overdosed, and then set fire to her body. So I will get to the outcome in a minute, but that's what we are sort of aware, that John was told to finish her off. Mark had technically already killed her or abused her, rendered her unconscious, so he could have killed her, but I think it was the other guy who actually murdered her in the end. I'm not sure. It is unfortunately very confusing case with not much detail. So on February 24th, the jury did return their verdict, and it took them about 21 hours of deliberation to decide. So Dean Carr, the 30-year-old guy who was involved, he was the one that was found guilty of Ellen Frith's murders, which is why I think he might have been one of the ones to maybe finish her off, and he was found guilty of murder. So he was jailed for life. I think he got a minimum tariff of 14 years before he is eligible for parole, which that's quite soon. It is coming up. If he gets out, I have no faith in the system. And then John Ashley, who was 34 at the time, he was found guilty of both the murders of Katie Baxter and Ellen Frith, but he was cleared of the murder of Zoe. He was given life, thank God, and he will serve a minimum of 25 years. And then finally, good old Marky boy, Mark Martin, who was 26 at the time, was found guilty of all 3 murders. He was sentenced to life in prison. Good. and he will never get out. He's believed to be the only Nottingham person out of all of the 64 people in England and Wales who are currently serving whole life tariff. So it basically means he has no chance of release, he won't get out, and that's pretty much it. So while they were in court, Mark gave no evidence. He also showed no remorse, no reaction. He just sort of sat there and was just like, sound. So when Mr. Justice Butterfield was passing the sentence, and he basically told the 26-year-old, quote, "The facts of these crimes are so horrific and the level of offending is so serious. You must be kept in prison for the rest of your life. These matters were committed by you because you positively enjoyed killing, taking the wholly innocent lives of these 3 young women for your own perverted gratification. You have not shown a moment of remorse. You have revelled in what you did, glorifying the macabre details of these senseless, brutal and callous killing." Unquote. So why did he do it? Because he wanted to be a serial killer. That's it. That is literally it. He wanted to be a serial killer, which we all knew, which is just so fucking weird. But while he was in jail, he did speak to a lot of cellmates and basically said there were a few reasons as to why he was killing people. He claimed that the domestic disputes between his wife was super triggering, and that's where he got this desire to kill. He also said it was because the mother of his child wouldn't let him see his own son, and he just snapped, which is fucking bullshit. I call bullshit. He was just a fucking weirdo. Like, from a young age, he wanted to be a serial killer. Like, his poor wife had nothing to do with it. So, in conclusion, what the fuck is wrong with people? But that is the story of Nottingham's first and hopefully last serial killer, Mark Martin. I'm so glad he didn't really get the fame that he wanted. Like I said, when I was researching this case, it was such a hard case to find information on, so I'm so glad that he didn't get this whole like limelight that he wanted. Such a piece of shit. That is everything for today's case. Thank you so much to Alicia for recommending this case to me. I'm so sorry if I didn't do it justice. Let me know your thoughts down below. Also, if you've got any case suggestions or just topic suggestions in general that you want me to cover, so anything weird, spooky, unusual, creepy, let me know too. If you are watching on YouTube, thank you so much for watching. Please give it a massive thumbs up, leave me a comment down below and subscribe if you are not. If you are listening on podcast streaming services, thank you so much for listening. It means a lot to me. Please rate, review, share whatever you can to spread the word, and I will catch you in my next one. Bye!